Hey guys, Halfadad here, with a bit of a different video. Don't worry, it's not about CSGO, it's still about Rocket League, but I am in CSGO because I want to show something. Well, the title of this video is Rocket League needs a console, and the reason I'm in Counter-Strike is because Counter-Strike has a console. Now, some of you may not know what even a console is, because I'm not talking about like a PlayStation in a Rocket League version or something like that. I'm actually talking about the developer console, and that's basically just a window that you can open in CSGO if you enable it in the settings. There's this setting, enable developer console, and if you do that and you set a binding for it, then you can open the developer console. And it's basically just a text field where you can enter commands, and a lot of those commands might be confusing to some people, but they also have a lot of advantages. For example, you can set the maximum FPS in CSGO just by the command FPS max. And you can already see it's currently set to 300, which is the default in CSGO. And you can set it to any number that you want. And that's really useful because in Rocket League you just have a slider and you're limited to what the slider provides. It also allows you to set the FPS max in the menu, for example, and that's just a great thing. Alright, I've switched back over to Rocket League because I want to illustrate something here. Because why would you even need a console? There's even an FPS slider here, and it allows you to set pretty much any value that you could want, up to 250 by default. But the problem is you can't usually go beyond. And the only reason I'm capable of doing that is because I have Bakkesmod installed, which allows me to set up to 500 with this slider. But such a slider in general is just a big problem, because obviously Psyonix could allow you to set the FPS to 500 like this slider, but that makes it less usable, I guess. It's like when you try to use it with the mouse and you try to stop at a certain value, it's not going to work that well. You can still use the arrow keys or a controller and set it to any value that you want. But in general, such a slider is just not the perfect way of doing this. For example, in the camera settings, we also have all of these sliders, and you can, for example, set the height to 100 or 110, and actually most pro players will set it to 100 or 110. And that leaves the question open, why can't you set it to 105? Because mathematically speaking, that's absolutely no problem, and in fact you can even hack it to be in between there. But if you hack it, then it's a question of, is it even allowed online? If Psyonix could provide something like this in a console, then you would be able to set it to 105 and it wouldn't create any discussion, I would say. The last point I want to make about why you would need a console is clutter. If you look at the options menu again, luckily they made an overhaul of the options menu. So since the tournament update, this is a little bit more easy to navigate and go around and find the setting that you want. But in general, it's actually can be really confusing. If you have a lot of settings on these pages, especially for a new player, it can be confusing. And while you may not care and I may not care about that, developers definitely do, because new players are important for any game. And if they get confused, then you're doing a bad job at UI. If you implement a console, then that console basically says, okay, we're giving you all these options, but it will be confusing. The moment the player starts using the console, there's basically this unwritten agreement that, okay, it might be confusing, it might not be as easy to use or as well laid out, but at least you can use all those features there, and the player knows when he opens the console that it's just the trade-off that he's gonna make. Okay, I talked about a lot of reasons now why you should have a console, but not really something specific for what settings I want. I talked about the camera already, especially with the height. I actually think there's a pretty big difference between 110 and 100 height, so setting it in between would be pretty nice. I don't think for field of view it doesn't really make a difference, but you could also set it beyond 110. I understand that the slider should only go to 110 because it starts to look really weird if you get really high. Or even, of course, if you want to set it below, that's basically unusable. So this slider has to limit the user in some way. But if he opens the console and basically says, okay, I know this is not maybe how the developer intended it, then I can still go to 120 FOV or, I don't know, 450 distance. Not like that would give any advantage to anyone. Maybe you could argue that field of view gives an advantage, so you could still obviously limit it in the console and in general to have a maximum value of 110 if you think that's an advantage to go beyond. But in general, you could allow just setting beyond also without making it confusing for a new player for why this game is so broken. Oh my god, you can set it to 120 and it breaks the game or something. That's not going to be an issue if you have it only in the console. The dodge dead zone setting is actually also something that I think would have been great in the console. Now that's in the game, obviously you can't remove the slider, but it's just something that is fine-tuning and it doesn't really have to be a slider, and every extra slider is just extra clutter. Same for the steering sensitivity, the aerial sensitivity. It's not really something that a new player needs in here. It's just something that could be in the console and would allow the pro players or just advanced players to tune this stuff without having to add a slider for everything. And there's actually something else in regards to dodge dead zone that I want to talk about. If you remember my dead zone visualizer, this is a web app that I created for the dead zone video and dodge dead zone video. So what you can do with dodging is put your mouse cursor here, or you can even use your controller, but I'm gonna use the mouse cursor now because then you can see where my mouse is. And you can see where the dodge direction will go. And for example, if you're in the red, then there will be no dodge, and that's depending on the dodge dead zone, which you can see like this. And you can currently tune this blue stuff, which I will call angle snapping, because that's what happens when you get at the exact edge of this. It's gonna snap to a straightforward dodge. You can actually tune it slightly. By increasing your dead zone, you will also increase the blue. But the problem is that your dead zone affects a lot of other stuff. And it would be possible for Psyonix to add the ability to tune this blue stuff without actually affecting the dead zone. And that would be yet another setting that they could add to the console without having to add another slider to the game, which once again would add way more clutter. So this would just be another great way to fine-tune players' controls, and you wouldn't have to clutter the UI too much. The console would also allow for more detailed graphics commands, for example. Another setting that could use something more dynamic like the shadow resolution is the render quality, because actually all that render quality does is reduce the resolution at which the game is rendered. If I set it to high performance, then the game user interface, like all this text and stuff, is still getting rendered at maximum resolution, which is nice, so you can read everything just fine. But the entire environment and the ball, everything is getting rendered lower. Actually at the lowest settings, high performance, it's getting rendered at 55% of the resolution I set it to. And that's just, for example, another setting that in a console you wouldn't have to choose one of these 5 settings. You could just choose a percentage, any percentage that you want, because that actually works just fine. The Unreal Engine can handle any percentage that you enter here that is 100% or below. There's also the argument that could be made that you can even allow the console on consoles, so on PS4 or Xbox, and you could even allow to set some graphics settings on there. So basically, if a player wants to play with lower texture quality, or I mean texture probably not, because then they have to export multiple kinds of textures, but at least something like bloom if it annoys you, or the light shafts if that blinds you, if you look into the sun, turning something like that off in the options. I don't think the console makers like Sony and Microsoft, they don't really want graphics settings in their menus. But if you include a console and then you allow players to disable graphics settings there, then I think they might be fine with that. I'm no expert on that though, so I guess Psyonix will have to deal with that if they decide to implement a feature like that. Another advantage of a console in combination with camera settings, which I forgot to talk about earlier, is actually that you can just copy paste them into the console. So basically a YouTuber or a streamer could just you put the commands to change camera settings in his description or in a message, and then you could just copy paste that straight into the console, and it would automatically set your camera settings without you having to do anything. Any adjusting of the sliders would just save a bit of time. That would be pretty nice. Some other commands that would just be nice to have for training is, for example, to reduce the game speed and play in slow motion. Actually, I'm opening Bakkesmod here, which has a console, and I can actually do exactly that in Bakkesmod and set the game speed to 0.5, and now I'm playing in slow-mo and it works just fine. Now, if you have a PC, there are a ton of reasons for why I would suggest installing Bakkesmod, this being one of them. There's also the ability to set the gravity in here and set it to -650. Wait, that is the default because gravity is down, of course. And if you set 650, then it's default gravity but up. And things like these are probably not too hard to implement for Psyonix. If Bakkes can do it, then it should be really easy for them. And it's just a thing that doesn't really work if you don't use a console, because you would have to create some interface to modify the gravity or stuff like that, and it creates a lot of overhead. But if you just add console commands like these, then it's a quick thing that can be done to make the console better. Alright, those are basically the most important commands, in my opinion, that could be done with the console but don't really work in any other way. But does that mean that's actually worth it for Psyonix to implement a console? Well, the truth about this is actually that the game already has a console, because Unreal Engine has a default console and it just integrates into any Unreal Engine game. But the console is disabled, so it's impossible to open it and run any commands. But Bakkesmod to the rescue, you can actually run Unreal command and a string, and there's, for example, stat FPS, which allows you to show the FPS in the top right. And it's an integrated FPS counter that any Unreal Engine game has. And for example, if you play Fortnite, you can see the same FPS counter in there. And there's actually a different command, also stat unit, which shows a complete performance graph, which is amazing for just testing and finding performance issues with your game. So the fact that this is actually in the game already, basically, but it's locked away unless you use Bakkesmod to enable this, is kind of frustrating. All Psyonix needs to do is enable the console that is in Unreal Engine already and disable maybe a couple of commands that they don't want to be used. But for example, these two commands are amazing and I don't see a reason for why they shouldn't be used. Another feature that I would definitely add to the console is the ability to bind buttons with the console. So you wouldn't have to go through this, which isn't a bad interface, but for example, you can't set two buttons to do the same thing. That's actually not a problem of the Unreal Engine or even Rocket League. You can actually set multiple buttons to do the same action, but you have to do it via the config files. And that's just a lot of work, and doing it with a console would be a little easier. And this interface just doesn't work that way, and having to redesign that interface just to have the ability to have multiple buttons set to the same action would be a lot of work again, and the console can basically circumvent that. Last but not least, like I said, a lot of these features I think would be great to have, and once you have a console, they're not that much work to implement. But for now, everyone that is on PC, you can use Bakkesmod, and it's absolutely great and has all these features that I showed, and it has a lot more. I'm gonna put a link to two great tutorials, I think, in the video description that show some of the basics of what it can do. Because Bakkesmod has this console, which is cool to set everything, but it also has a user interface actually to set even more. Or actually not even more, you can set everything with the console, but you can also set almost everything in this user interface. For example, the zero gravity or inverse gravity. and play around with this. Then you can set the game speed to any value. And you can do, yeah, limited boost, unlimited boost. Psyonix recently added that, but that's also one of those things that's, once again, a new checkbox in the options that wouldn't have been needed if you just add a console. Because if you add more and more checkboxes, it's just getting more and more cluttered, which isn't the best thing for a user interface. So yeah, there are a lot of features here in Bakkesmod, and I'm not gonna go over all of them because it's simply too much for one video, or at least I would have to make a completely different video for Bakkesmod. Look at the 2 videos in the video description if you want to find out a bit more, but it's definitely worth it to download Bakkesmod if you're a PC player. Alright, that is about all the content I wanted to cover in this video, but I want to talk about the format of this video a bit, because it's a little different. I don't have a script right here, I've just had a couple of bullet points and I'm trying to do it on the fly. And the reason I'm doing that is just because it saves a lot of time to not write a script. That doesn't mean that all my videos from now on are gonna be like this. Absolutely not. The normal rocket science episodes are gonna stay the same format, but I'm trying out this because something like this topic, the console, I don't think this is as important of a topic as some of the other things I do on the channel, but I still wanted to talk about it, and this is a way of doing it which doesn't delay my other videos too much. So maybe give me some feedback on this. Did you like this? Would you like to see more of these episodes as long as they don't delay the other videos too much? And also, would you like to see patch updates done in this way? Because I can definitely do them way faster. I usually, well, it depends on the patch. On 1.43 I did a lot of testing, so it took me almost a week to actually test the stuff. But with the newest video of the patch, I was actually done after like 2 days of testing easily, and I could have maybe released the video 2 or 3 days after the patch if I did it in this format. Of course, shout out to my patrons who give me the financial support to do this as a job and allow me to create videos regularly. Follow me on Twitter and/or join my Discord, and I'll see you guys soon for the next video.